Hello, and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duval, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man whose appointment to FEMA should be finalized within the week.
Tim Longo.
Hello.
That sounds suspicious. I don't know if I'm up for this appointment.
You'll be getting your email from Bob Page 51 any day now.
Really? You're starting off with that? Amazing. You must be tired because you're just going right in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us how many hours of driving you did today.
I did 10 hours of driving today, and man, I am fried.
And it's 9:30 his time, so
it is, in fact, 10:30 my time.
10:30.
That's fine. It's no problem.
I can't count, and we've already established that.
That is well established. We are starting a new game series today with Deus Ex, which is probably the most connected to other games we've played game. Because it's kind of in our wheelhouse. It's an immersive sim, so it ties in with Ultima Underworld. It also was made in Texas, as were the Ultima games, so it ties in that way as well. And it's an Ion Storm game. It's related to Looking Glass and therefore Irrational games. It is the most Dev Game Club game.
We've actually kind of, in a weird way, put this one off for a while because we were kind of, I guess, waiting for the universe to tell us when. Because it is a convergence point, really, to not overuse a silly term that I think people use too much, including myself. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's kind of a culmination of a bunch of different ideas coming together in a sweet spot. You know, I think a lot of at least from our outsider's perspective, a lot of the perfect developers kind of ended up on this team as well. You know, that Warren Spector kind of had discovered a few of them, Harvey Smith, and others who've gone on to do great things and continue to do so. And and then it was Ion Storm, which we've played, Anachronox as an example. We talked a little bit about that then. So it was kind of this early indie game, like game dev as Rockstar kind of mentality, bucking the trend that allowed games like this to happen, but yeah, you're right. You could see the lineage coming through, and Warren was involved with a lot of, with the System Shock, 1 and stuff like that. So,
and there are people who are still involved with, for example, Arcane. Ricardo Bear was a designer on this, and he's I believe a writer, maybe on Prey and Dishonored 2. So he's with them, and Austin Grossman is involved with writing as well. He's also a fiction writer. He's written a couple of books. You look at sort of the some of the other folks, and you're like, oh yeah, these are names that have kind of been around this a bit. There's probably more if I dig in a little bit deeper, but it definitely is coming in 2000. It's one of those games that we just look at as like, oh yeah, this is one of those darn good ones that are from early in our career and pretty formative as a result. So it's definitely a game I remember going into work and talking about quite a lot with you or with Reed, or especially with Reed, because I think he was playing it through twice at once. He was playing two games,
sounds like
playthroughs at the same time. Like,
you're totally right.
I have this save game and I have this save game.
You're totally right. I remember that. Yeah. This is the Reed game. Yeah. Oh man. One of the notes I wrote down, and not to jump in too quickly, but I feel like at some point, and definitely there's a lot of, in games we've played on the podcast, as well as ones we haven't played yet, there's definitely lineage here that we owe, we owe respect to. But I feel like Deus Ex was a game that sort of became a verb in a way, where we would talk about like, when you describe a game that was sort of doing multiple paths and had, even though we talked about this with System Shock 2 to some degree, and obviously Underworld, it was like, oh yeah, they're doing a Deus Ex thing there, or they're, I'm going to Deus Ex this,
because it's more committed, I think, to some of that sort of environment building in the way of, we are going to literally have different people. There will be stuff that people don't cover. Whereas whereas Ultima Underworld doesn't feel that way. There might be secrets or
It
whatever
was
that
more accidental.
right,
Yeah.
that some
Maybe.
people find and some people don't. But you're going to go into the same rooms and more or less cover them in the same way, regardless of what character sort of archetype you choose to play. And that's true of System Shock 2 as well. And here it's literally building out levels in such a way that it completely supports different play styles. In the way of sort of mixing in Thief with something a little more straightforward, like System Shock 2 as far as combat goes. So yeah, it's a unique mix.
Well, I think the merger of genres was more. I also remember, especially because we were working on in and around shooters at the time ourselves. The merger of RPG-ness, in with action, and you have the Mass Effects later that owe a lot to this, and things like that, where it started to happen with these other games, but this one, for me at least, and I feel like in our group when we would talk about it, and I think a lot of Western developers this was sort of not the official permission, but it was like I said earlier, a junction point. You see what I did there?
Well done. Yeah, nice.
A junction point.
I appreciate it. You don't appreciate it. Don't overdo it. Never sell it. Are you trying to say it was the origin of?
Oh, nice. Dev jokes. Anyway, the permission to kind of merge genres that weren't, typically seen as compatible. You know what I mean? It was like, oh yeah, I can actually have a pretty deep, skill. In this case, it's well, no, they have skills and augs, but different RPG trees that I'm choosing from, combined with first-person shooter mechanics as well as inventory management. All these sort of things kind of mush together, but in a more elegant way, with an interesting story at the time, and just kind of like, oh yeah, I guess you can put these things. This, chocolate and peanut butter do go together well.
Well, but also going all the way. I mean, it's something we'll probably talk about a lot more later. But having literally complete branches in skill trees, while not feeling like those are different classes and things like that you would see in a traditional RPG. It's, I can take this augmentation and put it in this way, and this other one, because it's a different part of my body, and put it in this way. And it sort of uses and also uses the body of the character as the RPG tree in a way. And so it makes sense that there's you're locking in different approaches to doing things. But not in sort of because you took this one, you can't choose these other things. It's more like, you made this choice, now you have another choice to make. And that choice that you're getting to make that second time is the same choice, regardless of how you chose the first one. And so that's kind of interesting too. And I guess you end up with 32 or 64 different potential character builds from an augmentation standpoint. I can't remember how many of those there are, but I think it's 5 or 6.
Yeah,
I could be wrong about that, but that's kind of an interesting, we have sort of RPG stuff, and you can put skill points in these things and differentiate yourself that way. But there are literally 64 different characters, or whatever it is, 32 or 64. I can't remember how many of those choices you make over the course of the game. So we'll return to that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I kind of partnering that with my point about sort of like giving other developers the permission to do that. Thinking back to System Shock 2, our first game, you did make an explicit choice about which direction in the beginning of the game, right? Because you had to choose your division. So that's sort of class-based in that way.
Psi, right?
Yeah, but this...
Soldier, Navy, or Psi. Something.
Yeah. But in this case, you don't. You're just kind of going through it and picking as you go. And it's not that it's lighter, but it's kind of more... To your point about connecting it to the body or to a more understood, easier kind of entry point for players, it connected to the things that were much more grokkable versus, the D&D standard of RPG. There's some opaqueness to that, right? Whether it be stats or classes or races or what have you, where someone who just wants to play an action-y game, but be introduced to some light RPG aspects would be intimidated by that stuff, right? Something like a Baldur's Gate. So, or even Underworld, that you had to choose a class there too. Though I guess it didn't mean that much in that particular case, but yeah, that's a good point. And the way that they're approaching it was, I guess, if you're coming at it from someone who likes action games, but maybe dabbles in RPGs, this was like a welcoming version of that, you still got the depth there, but you didn't have to worry about all of it. And that's kind of why I brought up Mass Effect a little bit, because I think that, some of the learnings there were, and the thing is, and my point about like Deus Ex as a verb, or as a sort of paradigm shift, to use another word that is overused, drink, is this, it just became like almost its own subgenre, of like, yeah, this is, you could see the tendrils coming off of this game since, up till today. And I just thought of a connection point for why we're talking about this game right now, that was accidental, and all the talk about Cyberpunk at E3, which is essentially Deus Ex,
exactly. As far as video games are concerned, that's basically where it starts.
Yeah, and so there's just I just listening to a lot of people and watching talk about it, and watching the videos and stuff, and reading the recaps, because I'm a big Witcher fan, as everyone knows, and a fan of CD Projekt Red. People, I feel like every other sentence bring up Deus Ex. You know what I mean? When they're talking about Cyberpunk, because it is that hybrid as well. But anyway, you want to talk about some of the games of the day, just to kind of set some context for people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a super interesting year, because you have Deus Ex, which is sort of the shooter with choice and consequences and things like that. But you also have on the PC, you have kind of some interesting games with a couple of sequels that are RPG sequels. So the RPGs are still kind of having their golden day between, or golden age rather, between Diablo 2, which is more of an action RPG, but also Baldur's Gate 2, which I guess is more or less nearing the end of the cycle of the Infinity Engine, as well as Icewind Dale. I guess Icewind Dale 2 would come along in a year or two after this. But you also have like The Sims, establishing a whole new genre of its own, which is kind of amazing. And as you pointed out, Hitman Codename 47, we played Hitman 2 near the beginning of the podcast, maybe our second game, I want to say.
I think so.
For that matter, also Final Fantasy 9. So, which was, I don't know, maybe the third or fourth game we played.
Oh, wait, was this out? That was out this year? I missed that one.
It was, yeah.
Wow, yeah. Rainbow Six, the original Rainbow Six, which was another sort of like, splinter off of the shooter space in a cool way, because I was a big fan. And then Quake 3 Arena, which talking about PC games and shooters and action, like the purest, the first Quake game that didn't have. Well, that was on Dreamcast. I take that back. So that was probably a later. Looking at the.
Yeah, it might have been the year before, but yeah. You also have, of course, Daikatana, which is another game from the same studio, or the same, same studio. They had two locations. This would have been the Austin crowd, whereas Daikatana was done by Romero up in Dallas, where, like I mentioned earlier, Anachronox was also done. So, on the consoles, you've got the advent of the PS2. So you've also got Dark Cloud and SSX and sort of launch title type stuff. It's the end of the Nintendo 64, so you've got some highlights there. For example, Perfect Dark, which is well remembered, and you have Majora's Mask, which is another one from that console era that was well regarded. So
Shenmue looks like.
Yeah, and Shen, yeah, that makes sense, because this was the sole year of the Dreamcast.
Yeah, looking at all these Dreamcast releases, so it's
maybe
a weird year.
Maybe into the second year of the Dreamcast, but it didn't survive this year. It was basically the end of the Dreamcast here. as we sort of move to the PlayStation 2 era, and then later that would add the Xbox and the GameCube. So so it's definitely an interesting time. There's other stuff still being done. There's Time Splitters on the PS2, pretty decent.
Soldier Fortune.
I think Time Splitters 2 is maybe better known as being a little bit better. Elite Force on the PC. You've got the shooters are pretty hot at the time, and so here you have a shooter that's coming in, and like Hitman, it's sort of differentiating itself. It's not a pure shooter, although you can play it more or less as a pure shooter if you want to. I mean, I think that was a goal for them to support, much like BioShock would have to do. I don't know, 6 or 7 years later. I think is it that much later? I can't remember BioShock. Its date, but
2000. I want to say
2007.
6. Yeah. Okay.
Seven. So you've got some sort of differentiation in the space, trying to figure out, well, what do we do with the shooter from here on out? You have some of the bleed in of RPG elements because those, like I said, they've had their golden age, and so you tend to have that kind of cross-pollination at that point when things are really popular. It's like, well, what can we take from that and put in our game, even though it's a different type of game? And and of course at this point adventure games are dead again, so you don't have a ton of those.
Escape from Monkey Island.
You do have EMI, but like I said, adventure games pretty much dead. I mean, it's definitely. Oh, and Thief 2, of course, this year as well. So there's another one I wanted to mention. Fertile ground in the shooter arena or first person, whatever arena at this point, as well as sort of endings and beginnings of console cycles, which are always kind of interesting times in and of themselves. I feel like Deus Ex ended up with a PlayStation 2 port. I can't remember if it also made it to the Xbox, but I'm fairly certain it made it to the PS2. And it would have a sequel a year or two later with Deus Ex Infinity War, switching engines to Unreal, which I think was controversial and probably not something we'll talk a lot about, but I do remember that being a thing.
You mean for this one is in Unreal, the first one?
This one is not, I don't think. No?
No, it is. Yep.
Oh, really? Oh. You sure about
I don't...
that?
Yeah, it says it has an Unreal logo in the beginning.
Oh, okay. I must have missed it.
The second one might have switched. Maybe that's what you're... I don't...
Oh, maybe I've got it backwards. Maybe I've got it switched around.
Oh, no, it is also...
Yeah, I remember the level loads being very frequent and that being sort of a thing, and I didn't remember that being an issue with this one.
I think...
It happens a bit, but it's more like Half-Life.
Yeah.
In that they're sort of, it's kind of streaming in and it's not constantly loading, and which I think was more of a deal with. Yeah,
I think the engine does, it probably will come into play a little bit as we talk about world structure as we go, because I think the engine has they do an interesting thing stretching the engine to and how the engine dictates how they have to build the world, but they did a good job at kind of making it feel more like a cohesive world, even though it is just a discrete level loading. A lot like our Half-Life conversation, to be honest.
Right.
So you're right on that. But that was I feel like that was them using Unreal was kind of a big deal for Ion Storm, because I feel like maybe they were one of the only ones in that crew that did that. Maybe, I don't know. Was Daikatana in? I don't remember. Anyway,
they may have switched with Daikatana. That might actually be what I'm confusing it with, because I know that was Quake 2 engine, right? So that might have been part of the.
Oh yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
Of course, they'd be more familiar with that because of knowing the id guys.
Yeah.
Being in Dallas, for that matter. So.
Yeah, but I mean, this is one of those games that. I know Brett and I always talk about it a lot, and we've like we said earlier, like this was one we knew we would get to at some point. But it is it's in one of those top 100 games of all time kind of lists, like it is just such an influential game. And I haven't gone back to it obviously in many, many years. So it's been interesting to go back and play it, and much of it still holds up, but definitely some of it doesn't, but I can still see the underpinnings of why it had such a big impact on the industry. Even though it definitely aged, quite heavily. But some of the ambition, man, that they're going after in this thing, especially because it's Unreal, and some of the tricks they had, I feel like they had to deal with to kind of achieve some of the stuff that they wanted to. Yeah. But it was enough to, I mean, IDOS did publish this, and then obviously retained the rights, and obviously went on to make more of them with the Montreal studio afterwards, which those games are actually prequels to this game. The ones that came out,
Human Revolution and Mankind Divided.
Yeah. So
and the series has also had a couple of offshoots with. There's something called The Fall, which I think is a mobile title, and Deus Ex Go, which is part of IDOS's Go titles. Lara Croft Go, Hitman Go, and Deus Ex Go. There might be another one, but those are the ones I can think of. So the Go series is kind of its own deal. Totally great, or at least the Hitman one is. Highly recommend that.
The Tomb Raider one is great too. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
RIP though, because they just announced they're not doing any more of them, which is unfortunate. But yeah. So I mean, when it comes to like one of the main things I definitely wanted to hit was my point about how that merger kind of created its own identity that kind of allowed a lot of games to start doing similar things, and it became that subgenre. And then you kind of touched on some of it that I definitely wanted to hit before maybe we kind of start talking about the opening level at the very least, or maybe training. I think we both have some stories to tell with that. And that's the other cool thing about this game / subgenre is that a lot of fun stories come from playing the games because it's so sim based. There are a lot of unexpected and wacky things can happen. But you touched on it before, just the concept from a identity perspective for the game, and basically fully embracing multi-route, multi-play style options. That they're really the concept, like, yeah, you got it, I guess, in RPGs to some degree based on classes, like you said, but the concept of really designing levels around the ability to accommodate play styles was definitely something that wasn't popular from a production standpoint at the time, because it just meant so much more work and so much more planning and kind of, what I think people would often say.
Well, specifically, it's often that you're building content that some significant percentage of your audience will never see unless they play the game again.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah. It felt like it was hard to justify sometimes because people felt like it was wasted effort, but therein lied the whole point of why it was special, because it's like, oh, wow. Wait, you did this? It was the water cooler talk, right? That we, like you mentioned, we would talk about at Lucas and stuff. And Reed usually probably leading the charge on that conversation of like, I did this. He'd have the conversation with himself. I did this, and then I did this on my other playthrough, and we were kind of all comparing notes and stuff.
Well, and there were definitely times I didn't get this far. There are times where I will get to a point and there will be a big narrative beat, and I'll be like, I don't want that narrative beat to turn out that way. How can I make that turn out a different way? And I'm thinking in particular of Gunther, who comes in and has kind of a big thing that he does not too long from now. And I found a way to kill him as he entered the room where he was going to do that, because I didn't want him to do what he was about to do. So there's things like that because everything is simulated, even their cutscenes, if you have managed to put things in the cutscenes, everything's still live and running. So there's a cutscene where Gunther comes bursting into a room, and I had a ton of those lambs, whatever those are, the little mini bomb grenades. I was like, well, he's going to come in here. Let me put a lamb here, and here. And as he comes in, they'll all blow him, straight to hell. Nearly taking me with him, just because I wanted to avoid the story thing that was going to happen. And you can do that, and the game survives it. It doesn't. It expects that weird things might happen, and it just deals with them.
Yeah,
that's great.
Yeah, that's. I was going to ask you too, because to offer up my own to answer my own question that I'm about to ask you, as I try to do on the podcast, I try to, when we play a game that we've played before, I try to mix things up quite a bit for myself, both to keep it interesting, but also just to see where the game boundaries change based on my memory of playing it the first time. And as people who listen to the podcast know, I generally, when I'm playing for fun, I'll play usually a non-lethal as non-lethal as I can whenever I play a game like this, and I'm fairly completionist about it and meticulous, like you said, little saves coming here and there, just to kind of not to get the perfect playthrough, but to be pretty exhaustive with how I play. And so this time, as I often do, both for time and just for fun of just not worrying so much about that and letting my OCD and anxiety like go away. I'm playing super chaotically and not being a completionist. So therefore, like not doing certain secondary objectives has been interesting because one thing I didn't really realize, because in the first playthrough, I remember back in the day, I literally did every objective. But they have complete scenes and dialogue changes happen if you don't do some of those secondary objectives.
Oh, interesting.
And I didn't know that until this playthrough, right? I just the main one. Let's see. Actually, the secondary objective in the first in the Statue of Liberty level, and then also the secondary objective in the warehouse one. I didn't do either of those, and you come back and you get scolded for it. And then also, I'm going super lethal this time.
Nice.
So like there are many people alive, and they're totally disincentivizing you in doing that, to the point where I went up to the guy that replenishes your equipment. What's his name? The Carter, I think. And the last time I went up to him, and he was going to replenish my ammo and give me some of the gear, and he's like, "I heard about how many bodies you took down. I don't agree with that being UNATCO's policy. I'm actually going to not give you the ammo I was going to give you."
Nice.
Because he doesn't want me to kill people anymore, because he doesn't think it's in the ethics of the organization. And it's super interesting that they, you know what I mean? So that the reason I'm bringing this up is branching paths, basically, right? They had to accommodate all of these variables based on what the player did, specifically with objectives, which are maybe more binary and they can track, but also body count and, how you handled certain things. Like maybe you did an objective, but maybe like there's in the warehouse hotel section, there's the hostages that you can save. I didn't get to save all of them. I only saved 2 of them. And they commented on the fact that some of them died and some of them didn't. Versus, so there's just all these permutations that that wasn't a common thing to have to worry about at this point, other than maybe like a Baldur's Gate or something. So that was just kind of cool to kind of test the boundaries of what the game did based on how I would typically play. So how are you?
And even there, I don't feel like in the RPGs of the time, there was a lot of non-mechanical reward or story or character development that had to do with these other things that you did.
Yeah.
So there's a reason they just call them side quests, and they really just wouldn't tie into anything else. They were really just ways to go and get some more experience, both literal and in the form of experience points. That's what I meant by mechanically. So you have this chance to just go and like, I'm going to go find this little village of goblins or whatever, and I'm going to kill them all, and I'll get some XP for all of that. But it's not like anybody on your main path would go, "Aren't you that guy who murdered all those goblins? They weren't doing any, they weren't harming anyone." You never had that sort of feedback, and they just didn't tie in. It was very rare to have that sort of thing in those games.
Yeah,
less rare in Planescape, which was around this time.
Yeah, and they were testing the boundaries there, as Chris Avalon talked about too. But yeah, I mean, they literally, like, even the incidental dialogue that the soldiers say to you as you're coming back and forth to the base is changing and impacted by how lethal I've been. Like they're giving me crap. They're like, "Woof, rough mission, eh? JC, or
that could have gone better, huh?
yeah, that could have gone better, or man, you're not holding back and stuff like that. And it's just neat to see that, because I think probably played this 2.5 times before this, and I think I played them all the same way.
I played it stealth, and I'm sort of playing it. I would describe how I'm playing it as knucklehead stealth, which is basically I'm not really going too slow. I'm just kind of picking a path and trying to go through it as quickly as possible. So I might tip some guys off, and often I'll just reload, like, oh, I guess I just need to wait under the 2 seconds. I mean, it's sort of like Benny Hill stealth. I'm like da, 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 as I run through the levels.
I think you just created a new term, knucklehead head stealth. That's thing
me
now.
Yeah, the thing.
I love it.
I was not. I'd just go around a corner. Like, there's a lot of places where I walk around a corner. Oh, I guess there's a camera there. Can I get under that? Oh, I can't get under that camera.
Yeah, yeah. Right.
And just trying to react to that, and basically sort of feeling out the game quickly by just running into areas, going, oh, okay, there's going to be a guy there, and then maybe a couple guys over here. So I need to make sure at least I come in here quietly and take this guy out quickly, with my stun whatever or things like that. Or just writing down information. One of the things that I really like about this game is that you don't need to go find passwords before you use them. So if you know them, you can just use them. They don't hold you back. Though I did have a complaint in the tutorial that there was a door where you were supposed to use a lockpicking or a hack module thing. Unitool, what do they call those things?
Multi-tool?
A multi-tool, yeah. You had to use a multi-tool on this thing, but it had a keypad. I'm like, well, I should be able to enter numbers on the keypad, even if they're wrong. But it didn't accept numerical input at all. You couldn't click the buttons. Nothing happened.
Oh, really? They didn't even let you.
That's weird. That's a strange choice. Like, why do that?
That tutorial is very linearly scripted.
It is. It's funny. At a certain point, I was getting annoyed that because there's a room where you can find some bullets, and you don't need bullets in that whole section. And you get to the end of the section, he just takes everything away from you. I'm like, but my extra bullets.
Yeah,
that's not fair.
Weird. Well, I had to start over.
I started doing things where I would go and I'd pick up all the plants in a room and be like, oh, you want to take everything? Okay, I'm going to put all the plants in your room. So you make sure you have everything before you take it away from me.
That's funny. Like, it doesn't. You're just
I'm a dork.
A bone. You've created a bone to pick for this fake character. That's funny.
I have. He's like, what? I'm a trained operative. You're not going to let me keep my pistol? What's wrong with you?
Well, I had to start over, so I started to forget how I failed the first time. And so I was racing through it, and all of the VO is scripted linearly. So I was like well into the tutorial, still listening to like the second room's VO, even though I had physically done 5 things after that. So, kind of just shows, how interesting a bulletproof script can be for a level. You know what I mean? If you do it right.
Oh, it's super. It's super hard to do it well.
That wouldn't happen. Yeah. But my funny training story, because I actually didn't finish it because I was like, I basically messed myself up, and I was like, never mind. I'm just gonna skip it. I'll just remember things if I get stuck or whatever. And so I was on the sniper shooting range, and I was still getting the controls down, and I accidentally threw my sniper rifle through the window into the I hit tab or something, which is like the throw button, and I threw it into the window toward the targets, and I couldn't reach it to pick it back up, so I couldn't finish. So I was locked in the room. I couldn't go backwards and I couldn't go forwards because it was waiting for me to fire at the target. But
I was working. I was in the room with all the lambs. Basically the motion sensitive bombs. Yes, it's a little further in. If you quit the tutorial, it might be the next room after the sniper. There was a medical robot in there, and I'm like, I don't need that, and so I blew it up with the grenade thing. and then I went and tried to open this. You were supposed to blow this door open. I got a little too close to that and blew my legs off. And now there was no medical droid. So I spent the next
You were
significant
crawling.
part of the rest of it moving very, very slowly because I had no legs.
Yeah, the health model. Oh, man, we'll talk about that later. But
yeah, no, it's definitely something we'll dive
so
into
many
later because it'll have more an impact, I think, later. But
so many subsystems. Yeah, but I just couldn't believe it when I threw that sniper rifle through the window. It was just like, oh man, seriously. I didn't want to start it over.
Yeah,
but then
that's a Benny Hill spy moment right there.
Yeah, I think I'm
Hello?
exactly. I think I'm playing Benny Hill aggressive mode or something because my equivalent story once like in the when you go to the subway in the warehouse level, I dropped down from the ceiling into one of the rooms with like 10 guys, and my tactic is running around the room in circles with a crowbar, just hitting them while they're shooting at me
save
and
all
each
that
other.
ammo.
Yeah, so I was just spazzing out, and it did work. I mean, I took a fair amount of damage, but that's kind of like I'm just gonna go for it. It's completely the way I would never play normally,
Right?
But it's refreshing.
It is. It's fun to do that stuff when you're, to try to play a different way, and that's why I'm not driving myself crazy with the stealth. I mean, in the past, I've definitely done that. And there are things that you miss, right? You miss, and that's kind of an interesting thing. I'm kind of curious how it'll play out because you'll miss things like, oh, there's an exploration bonus if you go find this thing. But if you're running around like an idiot, you're not going to find all that stuff, etc.
Yeah.
So you end up missing out on things. There's probably other sorts of things that are like that I haven't even found yet. But it's sort of funny. And you can, if you're kind of running around in that way, you can also miss out on, oh, if I had just spent a little more time looking around, I would have found the key for this thing instead of burning a lockpick or a multi-tool or what have you.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of that too, where it clearly has a sort of agenda as far as rewarding the meticulous, slow play, more than the sort of gung-ho, guns blazing, oh, I came across a thing, let me just do, whatever to open it immediately sort of play. So it is really interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, I'm a little worried about that for myself because my play style was conveniently aligned with, like you said, the way that they incentivize the game generally. And now that I'm playing kind of basically completely counter to that, even to the degree where certain NPCs, I don't care if they die. And I think that maybe I'm losing a mission or something from them in just the chaos that I've wrought, by jumping into a room, falling in from the ceiling and crowbarring everybody. And I think, yeah, I'm not only XP, but yeah, just like, because there'll be some of the NPCs you can talk to will give you like these little, not full missions, but these little tasks, almost fetch quests or sub things. There's definitely more of them in the second level, second section in the subway section, but those characters I don't think have to survive, right? They can just die. And to your point about like the number of states that they're accommodating for the game, and the game allows it without having an A bug or something, is just crazy that they were able to kind of debug this thing, because there are so many permutations.
Right. They basically have to make an assumption that at any point it's not any given character may not be alive. And so they need to accommodate that. And I seem to remember, and I'll see if I can track this sort of thing down, but I'm pretty sure that was a discussion that they had at the time of how they managed that risk and that way of thinking about the game in something like Game Developer Magazine.
Yeah, for sure.
And maybe the Postmortem or something like that. So
this game caused all sort of. I remember GDC a year or two after. Actually, I think it was 2001, because 2000 was my first GDC. 2001, after this game had come out, Warren Spector was just kind of on this whole crusade about emergent gameplay. Do you remember that at all? Like,
it hasn't really stopped.
It hasn't. No, just fair. It hasn't.
He's still on that crusade.
Oh, you mean for him? Yeah, for
Right.
him. Yeah, it's old hat for him. I just mean as an industry, though, right? He was one of the ones that initiated it, but it just was such a buzzword for so many years. Like even myself, I will fully admit, emergent gameplay. Now, I think luckily as an industry, it's just become a part of the ingrained lexicon, and we've just accepted it as not a buzzword. It's just a thing, you know. And so that's a good thing. And we shouldn't over talk it, but I just remember this game being obviously for him and one of the biggest, one of the bigger, more vocal people about it, talking about it. That we've already talked about multiple examples of just emergent gameplay coming from systems, right? And the simulation, as you said, kind of mixing that all together for unexpected results. And they were the first ones to say that they didn't plan on everything,
right?
That the player would come up with. And I think that was just, wasn't a lot like that. It was just, the industry was so mechanically driven,
Yeah, I mean, you started to see it in the work at Looking Glass and later Irrational. You started to see it, prior to this in Underworld, like we talked about. And it was just sort of, because you simulate so much more, the fact that you are simulating leads to a large number of states that you can't necessarily predict. And one of the things that I think that is a challenge for designers who work in this sort of space is it's kind of twofold. It's one, how can we make these building blocks add up into something interesting? So you sort of have to have this sort of ability to put the Legos together to make lots of different shapes, right? Instead of, if the Legos only fit together so they go in a straight line, that's not very interesting. You need to be able to kind of let the player do whatever they want with these sort of Legos as far as systems go. So there's that. On the other hand, you need to also find a way to constrain it enough that it's testable and buildable. It's a thing that you can actually do. And then furthermore, you need to make those combinations as interesting as possible so that the players feel naturally rewarded by the way that these systems interact. And I think that's stuff that you sort of started to see happen around this time. You started to see it, especially with other sort of open world games. I was thinking like Grand Theft Auto 3 with sort of the, I lit this thing on fire, and then and that was next year. So the fire department came, and then all these people were gathered around, and then this thing blew up, and it flew over here, and it landed on the fire engine. The fire engine exploded, right? And you just have these sort of chained together of crazy stories that are like, nobody designed anything that made that happen, but lots of interesting things could happen from just a few small systems because the thing's simulated. It's a fairly detailed simulation of a world, usually involving physics.
Yeah, well, and I think design started changing, right? No one designed it in the traditional sense. Not traditional, but in the linear sense. But there were design thoughts put into it that were more about the way the systems interacted, and the tuning of that and the cause and effect of it, and then just kind of going into sort of faith-based development where you're going to be, once you set those things in motion, you have to be okay with what can come out of it, right. And having those things clash and embracing that versus, I think, again, not that this is the only sort of fork in the road for this kind of mentality, this particular game, but it's definitely one of them. Before this fork in the road, there was a I think anxiety about like, well, I didn't intend for that to happen, so therefore it's wrong. But you know what I mean? But this was I think some of the beginnings of where it's okay to let systems interact and let the player own some of that.
The sort of death of the designer here in that way, right? The designer can't design every interaction that's going to happen. The player becomes a designer more of that experience,
or even shouldn't. It's like right. not only can they not just because you're human, but also maybe it's not even a good idea. Maybe the system, maybe building systemic. And I don't know if this is the case, but if you think about the games of the era around before this, the games that were embracing that even more were almost, were the games that were heavily sim, like a Sim City or something. And it's almost like bringing bringing in those elements, like your fire and fire department example, like that would happen in SimCity, but
True. Yeah.
but in GTA, it was fully realized as if you were a character in the world seeing the same thing happen. But you're putting those two things together and being okay with it. I don't know, it's like it's just an interesting time for that to happen. And now it's just kind of we just accept it more. But
Right.
and
Now we're going to make systems that we know are going to interact. We design them in such a way that the world is not reacting explicitly to this object on fire. It is, there is fire near me. There's something emitting a fire, notification saying, "Oh, by the way, I'm on fire. I'm near you." And that could be a barrel, or it could be a car, it could be a human running by that's on fire, or an animal or something like that. And that thing now has to react to all of that. So you have to engineer how you build these things differently as well. Whereas back in the day, it was more like, oh, you're going to light this thing on fire. It was more of an adventure game style puzzle. Oh, right. You're gonna light this specific thing on fire. And I mean, it's sort of like when we play Day of the Tentacle and you're like, well, why doesn't this gold teeth do this thing that I expected, right? I mean, I can remember that being a thing where he's like, well, I expected that, these gold things versus those gold things were all gold. It's fine, whatever it was you were trying to do. And
we thought that was a red herring.
Right. You kind of came up, exactly. You kind of came up to the edge of, well, this is not a simulated game. These are explicit solutions to problems. And it became a design challenge for them to not miscommunicate how the world worked. Like, you only can have one solution. Therefore, you want to make sure there's nothing that's kind of close to that solution. And when you embrace simulation, you can just throw that all out entirely and say, you know what, anything goes. You put whatever you want in here because it's fine. We'll simulate it and figure out how it works. You're limited only by sort of computational complexity. So,
yeah, that's a good point. It's sort of the era of how do I get inside the designer's head, like we talked about with adventure games, Day of the Tentacle, and those sorts of things. Versus, you don't need to, and in fact don't want to. You just want to get inside your own head as a player and think about what the rules of the world are. I think it's not completely maybe true in every case, but I think for me, being such a big Zelda fan, that was with no pun intended, that's why Breath of the Wild was such a breath of fresh air, because Nintendo has always been so good at the curated design of video games, and in Breath of the Wild, they just fully embrace simulation and emergent and systemic gameplay and the dynamics of everything. Right. And it still was kind of finely crafted, even though as a player, I could really fool around in that game and create really unexpected results. And it was kind of like crazy for Nintendo to go that far, as a recent example.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, looking at this year where Majora's Mask came out, it's a very different sort of game. I mean, there are more, well, I don't want to say simulated aspects, but there are scheduled aspects more so. And so that interaction kind of becomes interesting. And that's maybe one of the innovations of Majora's Mask, in that there is a schedule of when things happen in the town and in the world generally. There are 3 days before this moon crashes into the earth and all that stuff. And if you're going to do all the stuff that you can do in the town, you need to plan your day around the sort of actions of those characters. But that is purely a scripted thing. It's not like the characters get hungry, and there's a rule for hunger to like go find stuff to eat. And right, I mean, that was a thing that happened in, I guess, Oblivion or whatever, and they had to scale it back because the people in the town wouldn't eat enough, and they ended up stealing food all over the place, and everybody would end up in jail. It was one of those sort of classic, like, oh, we didn't know how to constrain that problem well in development, and you had these weird snowball effects that would occur. Just kind of funny. Anyway.
Yeah. I think, I mean, we can start closing down. The last thing I'll say to put a pin in for next time that we need to start hitting is, apart from all of the systemic and emergent stuff that we're talking about with this game, and we'll get into this more as we go, the other interesting thing that I remember being important about the game is, despite all of the flexibility the player has, there was still a pretty interesting conspiracy story happening at the same time. So it's like you kind of had the best of both worlds in a way. And so we'll obviously get more and more.
You definitely have a rich narrative environment, and that's totally something we'll talk about.
It's kind of counterintuitive to think that those both could coexist, because
Minecraft doesn't have it, for example, right? I mean,
right.
It has a mode that's sort of story mode, but it's not really a story.
Well, even Breath of the Wild story is very, very, very light, So
and this is very intricate.
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting to achieve both, even though there's definitely some cheese in there. But being a conspiracy theory kind of nut myself, like it's fun to see it in and amongst this game that was pretty dynamic. So for next time we can hit that. But
we'll definitely dive into that at least next time, and probably more in the future.
Yeah, as well. All throughout, and you'll have to tell your Bob Page story eventually. Maybe it's at the end.
Yeah, we'll get there. All right. We have a couple of reviews. We're going to kind of move quickly onto those because, as Tim mentioned earlier, I am a tired man today. We have a couple of reviews. Those are through the Apple Podcast app. I'm subscribed around the world, and I will see them. We don't have any emails this time. We did get a couple emails, and I'll talk about that in a minute. They're long and from games we played a while ago. But you can shoot those to devgameclub@gmail.com. But for now, let's hit the first review from you. It's short and sweet, like you.
Jeez, are you kidding me? Yeah, you are tired. This one is titled Two Dev Friends. Oh, that's stretching it. I don't know about that. But by
one dev, one designer.
Debominic, I guess is how you say that. That's pretty good. There's a great rapport between Brett and Tim, and their insight is valuable to all creators and lovers of video games. Appreciate it. Debominic.
Debominic. That's pretty good. I like that.
I like it.
It's like Dominic, but Debominic. Got it? And I have one from the Second Quest. He was somebody who sent us a couple of emails. Sorry, Second Quest. I have been traveling and I have not had a chance to reply in depth. They are long and detailed about Link to the Past and Super Mario 64, which we played a while back now, so we probably won't read them on the show just because they're pretty disconnected from having played the games. But I will get back to emailing you. However, he says, entertaining and informative, really enjoyable series that sheds some new perspectives and insights into familiar and classic games. Sometimes those perspectives and insights come from the hosts having never played a game before, sometimes from a range of past experience with the title, and sometimes simply helping the listener themselves reevaluate something familiar that we may have taken for granted. All wrapped in further insights from their experience within the industry itself. Highly recommended. So we appreciate the reviews and the kudos. So you can send those to us. Those are great for us to reach out and reach new audiences. We appreciate them very much. It's a great way for us to reach new listeners. I already mentioned the email address, so you can shoot us an email there at devgameclub@gmail.com. We do like to get your questions and perspectives and thoughts so that we can argue about those questions here as well, or try to answer them as best we can. I don't know where we're going to play to next time. We may have to simply put that out on the Twitter.
Yeah, that just dawned on me that I did not prepare for that. So.
We didn't think that far ahead, and I certainly didn't.
No. I'll look into that.
Yeah, but we'll put that out on our Twitter feed at DevGameClub. You'll also be able to find me on Twitter at Brett_Duville and him at
Tim Longo Jr. with a JR at the end.
Short one tonight for us, but we hope for this week you'll have a good time playing video games. And for now, good night.
Good night.